Hi everybody, welcome to my presentation. Before we get started, I just want to ask you one question. How many of you know someone that chose not to vote in the most recent presidential election? Whether that be you, a friend, a family member, or a colleague? A majority of the time, you ask someone why, and it's usually one of the two reasons. One, my vote doesn't matter. Or two, I didn't really like either of the candidates. Now, although you aren't technically required to exercise your right to vote, imagine the type of country we'd have if everyone had that mentality. Based on the research of this project, younger generations have lacked in participation in elections in the last decade. That leads me to the ultimate question of my project. How do we encourage younger generations to vote in the presidential election without forcing it upon them? My name is Angelina Cruz, and this is the process I use to solve that question. Now, let's get started. Part 0, News Journal and Questions. Over the course of 2 weeks, I gathered articles that related to the presidential election, the debate, job loss, and updates on the pandemic. For every article, I produced 2 to 3 questions. This step helped me build an overview of the current state of politics in the U.S. Part 1, Empathize. Now that I have a layer of information, a few of my classmates and I combined our research, which was then used to build our affinity maps. This step allowed me to organize and narrow down my insights for the next step. Part 2, General Research and Define. With my insights from Part 1, I narrowed it down to 4, using the How Might We method, a brainstorming technique that allows your mind to consider new perspectives and ideas that may lead you into new directions. This step wasn't entirely easy. It felt like I was rewording 2 or 3 of the same questions. Essentially, what I did was look back at my insights and reconsider where I was coming from. After producing the How Might We's, I gathered facts about young voters in America to understand where they lie in terms of voter turnout. After this step, it was time for me to touch back on my ultimate question. How do we encourage younger generations to vote in presidential elections without forcing it upon them? Relating back to the How Might We's and insights, I came up with a few ideas based on the collected information. This essentially helped me identify where the issues lie. This brings me to Part 3, In-Depth Research. At this point, I already had the basic foundation I needed to get started. All I had left was to conduct my own survey and reach out to first-time voters on their experience with politics and the election. The purpose of the survey served as a way for first-time voters to express what they do and do not prefer. The results of the survey allowed me to identify the key factors of gaining a young adult following. Of the factors, I chose 3: social media, education, and the home environment. Part 4, Ideate and Prototype. In this step, I generated as many ideas as I could using the 3 insights from Part 3. Using brain mapping and the How Might We method, this allowed me to expand my ideas, targeting who, what, where, how, and why. Thus, I was getting a little bit closer to my final prototype. Using the rough ideas, I developed 10 low-fidelity prototypes. Out of the 10, I chose 1 to further expand the visuals. Down to the last image, I decided that social media was the breadwinner. My idea was to essentially design an Instagram page created by an organization built of college students that focuses on educating the youth on politics and important information regarding elections. The page will be interactive with the audience and provide resources with valuable information. Part 5. Test and iterate. For this final step, it was time to get feedback and make a few adjustments to my final prototype. I reached out to 5 first-time voters, introduced my prototype, and asked for feedback. I found that almost all of the feedback had concerns regarding interaction and interest, so I decided to focus on those two specifically. How will I interact with the audience and keep them interested? I then began to brainstorm again and try to expand my perspective. As a result, the concept of my prototype didn't change. However, the decision to focus on those two factors shifted my ideas in good and bad ways. Instead of my page only being available on Instagram, I decided to include Facebook and Twitter because it reaches a larger audience. I also added key factors such as event planning with schools and guest speakers as a way of interaction. And in terms of keeping the audience interested, I came up with the idea of teaming up with social media influencers and celebrities to speak on current issues and the news. Overall, this step changed the direction of my original idea, but it also allowed me to expand on them as well. The purpose of this prototype serves as a resource of relevant information on the current state of politics in the U.S. Accessible to anyone and everyone, the main goal is to reach out to young voters and encourage them to use their rights as a citizen and essentially increase the number in young voters. Social media stores very valuable sources of information and is very popular among younger generations. Therefore, using social media to attract a young audience is perfect because everything they will need to know is already at their fingertips. As information spreads and encouragement to engage in politics continue, that may lead to higher voter turnout for the youth, because information that would normally be unknown will be available to them with easy access through. Now, this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining me through my process of my project. Have a good night.